Hey guys, welcome to the Sisyphus 55 podcast. Today we're joined with Eamon Dolan, who is the vice president and executive editor of Simon & Schuster, and he's also one of the editors of Mary Trump's Too Much and Never Enough. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Eamon Dolan. I'm exactly who you said I was. I am the editor of Mary Trump's marvelous book.
Apologies.
No problem at all. You can have a lot of authors, but you really only should have one editor per book. So I was the lucky guy who got to do that one. More about me will be revealed as we continue, but that's, I suspect, all people need to know as we get started.
Okay. So I guess firstly, could you explain kind of the job of an executive editor and the sort of process that goes into editing a book in general?
Sure. I'm going to leave a lot of stuff out because it could take up the whole hour to explain what it is. But I'll say, first of all, that, oh my God, it's like the best job in the world. It's really hard and you don't get paid that much, but it is so fun. If you're a curious person, the job gives you this excuse to go to whoever is like the reigning expert or the most interesting person on any topic and ask them to give you like a master class in whatever that topic is. And it's, in the guise of writing a book about this topic. So some of my job, a fair amount of my job is talent searching. Going out and finding these people who can actually answer the questions that are of most importance to me. A lot of the job, I will say, is sifting through, I do mostly nonfiction, and nonfiction comes in it usually doesn't come in as a complete manuscript. It comes in as what we call proposals, which, if anyone is in the academic world listening, they're kind of like grant proposals. They're an indication of what the author wants to do. One of the great challenges of the job and great excitements of the job for me is taking an idea and helping an author figure out how to make 100,000 words out of it. So, because if you think about it, most books take, Mary Trump was an exception, because that book took about 6 or 7 months from beginning to end. Most books take 1.5 to 2 years, often much more than that. So as an editor, part of what you're doing is you're looking over, book editor, I should say, as opposed to a magazine editor or any other format, you're looking 2 years over the horizon at least. You're trying to imagine what's going to interest the world in a couple of years. And I'm pretty good at that. And that's a skill that takes a lot of time to sort of master, to polish up your crystal ball and get all the dents out of it takes a while. But you're also the other crystal ball that you're looking through is the one that tells you what the author's idea or the idea you've hatched with the author could turn into based on your own acumen, the author's acumen. And in that case, pardon me, I'll interrupt myself by saying there's also a practical concern here. It takes an author, in most cases, it takes a lot of effort. I mean, think about it, even earning minimum wage, you need thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in order to support yourself while you do the work of making a book. And you can't do that work in most cases beforehand. You can't do it on spec. You have to find someone like me who's willing to give you a whole bunch of money and hope that you're able to do what you promise you're going to be able to do. So this is why these people write these proposals. They're looking for money from me that we call an advance. It's an advance on the money that we hope the book earns one day in the future. And so I give them money to carry out the thing they say they can carry out. And then I also give them a lot of different kinds of support along the way, pointing them towards certain ideas, pointing them away from certain other ideas, and just help pull them through the process from idea to execution to publication. That was a long answer to a short question. I hope it made some sense.
No, that was a good answer. So it sounds like it's quite a few different skills wrapped up into one. There's that kind of anticipation for what the general public will have interest in a few years. There's also this synthesis of information, this kind of almost talent scouting where you kind of find who's capable of generating these ideas. That does sound that sounds very fun. That also, I mean, it does sound very demanding too.
Both. Yep. And the other thing I would say is that describes the process. That describes only part of the process. Another part of the process is figuring out what you might call messaging or branding around the book. You know, what should the thing look like? What's the first thing we should say about it? What's the second thing we should say about it? One of the great things about the job is also one of the challenges about the job is, as an editor, you're somewhat like the director of a film, and you're somewhat like the producer of a film. You know, the author is the one who's sort of bringing the most, creative energy to the book. But you're also, as a director does with a film, you're also guiding, how long each shot lasts, and where do you start with a wide angle, and then move into a close-up. Like, there are analogs to that in the writing process that are as much the editor's job as they are the author. And then the producer part of it is you're also, I have to make money. This is not a nonprofit. I have to make sure that things are on time, that they're under budget, that they that the jacket looks a certain way that's actually going to sell copies and doesn't one of the few challenges that I have when dealing with authors is it concerns title and jacket. The author's off, and I understand why authors are so strongly wedded to certain ideas of how their book should look and what it should be called. I'm a parent. Like, if someone came up to me and told me you should name your son Nebuchadnezzar, I'd be like, screw you. And yet Nebuchadnezzar could be the most selling name. It could be the name that gets my son, onto the Supreme Court or whatever. And I, in instances like that, part of my job is, I often say that editing is like practicing psychology without a license. Part of the job is helping authors see their project as the world will see it, not as they see it. Because of course if you're writing for yourself, go ahead, write for yourself, keep your journal, that's great. But if I'm publishing your book, you're not writing for yourself, you're writing for other people. You have to serve them, not yourself. And
so it's kind of this balance between,
Go ahead.
Oh, it's sort of a balance between like pragmatism, figuring out what's going to sell, what's going to look good, and then also that creativity where you're tapping into something a bit more fluid and kind of hoping that the author is as passionate about this idea as you are and willing to commit to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I want to sort of guide or shape their passion without dampening their passion. It's I'm the junior partner. Every book is a collaboration. Every book, there's an old a joke in legal circles that anyone who represents themselves in court has a fool for a client. Nobody can write a book by themselves. It's too big an undertaking. It's one of the most complicated things that a person can do. So you need someone to sort of backstop you and bounce things, someone to bounce things off of, all of that. I'm the junior partner. But I got to be there. Someone like me has to be there, and someone like me has to be sort of shoring an author up at some points, and giving them hard truths at other points. And that's again, that's the sort of practicing psychology without a license part of it. But it's also, I think one of the misconceptions of the job that normal people have is that it's sort of isolated. You're off in your little ivory tower and you're scribbling away. it's an incredibly social job. I mean, an introvert can do this job well for sure, but it's good to be an extrovert as well. It's good to really love people and to love interacting with them. When non-COVID times, I'm out and about all the time. Prospecting for authors, talking with agents. We haven't really talked about agents, but they're a huge part of this equation, publishing equation as well. I'm curious about the inside of other people's heads, and part of what's great about being an editor is you get access to other people's heads in a way that it's just really hard to do outside of, maybe a couple of, loved ones and close friends. You get an incredible amount of access to the inside of other people's heads. And it's just so endlessly fascinating to see those realms. That's one of the great perks of the job.
So how do you kind of conceptualize your journey into becoming an editor? Did you kind of know from the outset that this is what you wanted to do with your life, or did you kind of fall into these circumstances?
More the former. So I was in college, and had originally thought I would go to law school, which of course every sort of in that era anyway, every kind of humanities major who didn't really know what they did thought, I'll go to law school. Right. And I had something of a revelation senior year, and my revelation was, I'm a good writer, but I have no ideas of my own. I wonder if there's a job for someone who's a good writer but doesn't have their own ideas. So I sniffed around a little bit, and it turns out that there are these people called editors who help other people shape their ideas and mold them. And like I would say, so much in my life and in my career has been the result of happy accidents. That was one of the rare moments where I happened to think a thing that was exactly the thing that put me in the place I needed to be when I was. So I went after college. I went and applied for jobs as an editorial assistant. This is an apprenticeship profession, by the way. You can only learn how to do it by watching how other people do it, and learning, osmosing their skill sets over time. So I had this idea that I could be an editor because, again, I was a good writer, but wasn't encumbered by my own ideas. And it turned out I was right. So I started at a place called HarperCollins, and I was, mentored for a few years by this great editor who, over time, again, taught me all the innumerable ins and outs of the job. And then I gradually developed my own vision, my own desires, and my own thoughts about what kind of books I wanted to do, and started doing some of them. And now it's today.
Oh, that's interesting. It's especially college. It's like that time where you'll just be 3 a.m. in the library, and you'll all of a sudden have a sort of revelation that will change the course of the rest of your life. Just you're constantly thinking about your future, and that is pretty interesting. That's how you kind of came about.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It was sort of 3 a.m. kind of thing, and I was very lucky. I mean, I mean, a lot of my friends took longer to arrive at the job, this job, than I did, or arrived at completely different jobs and took longer. I mean, I think anything you do, anything you do before 30 is just part of your education and should not be counted against you if you sort of, if it doesn't land you in the place that you ultimately end up enjoying. I was lucky in that I kind of, by happenstance, figured it out when I was 21 or 22, and then it's been a straight line path from there to here.
Right. And you also mentioned that you're a professional photographer, and that this has helped sort of craft this, I guess now that you've mentioned that bridge between creativity and pragmatism, and in kind of empathizing with the authors, like the creative types. If you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Oh yeah, I can definitely riff on that. So I came to photography relative in sort of the opposite way than I just described how I came to my day job. I sort of stumbled on it a few years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. And I always, I had something of an artistic bent when I was in high school and college. And then, as often happens, life intrudes, and you let your early, I stopped playing, music, and I stopped doing art, and, because, I got to get the job done and that kind of thing. But I'd always really been interested in photography from a very, from whatever, middle school or high school. And I had a particular fascination with the great mid-century street. There's a kind of photography genre called street photography, which is just candid stuff shot out in the open. And, you're trying to capture in a particular moment something that goes beyond the moment, someone's angst or dignity or panache or whatever. And that always really appealed to me. And I tried to do it myself back in the day, shooting with an SLR and all of that. And it was like, I could kind of sort of do it, but all of that stuff is really, I don't know if you've ever done it yourself, shooting with an old school SLR, but you've got to set everything up beforehand, and you've got to get you've got to get the aperture right. You've got to get, you've got to have the right kind of film in your camera, all of that stuff. And I tried, and I just, I didn't have that acumen. I wasn't able to pull that off. And then decades pass, and along comes the iPhone, and suddenly that stuff wasn't an issue anymore. You could snap photos or tap photos instantaneously, and all that work, or much of that work that used to go into setting up the shot, now was at the back end. There were all these great editing apps. Photoshop, of course, but there's a bunch of great ones. I use Snapseed that reside as apps in your phone, and that allow you an enormous amount of control over the image. And once the technology allowed me to move that kind of work that had to be done beforehand to the back end of the process, I found myself able to use my skills such as they were in terms of composition and spotting, the capturing, spotting the right moment, and then making in post, making the photo what I wanted it to be. And again, I had said this is something I stumbled upon. It really was also a function of social media. I took a photo of a bunch of water tanks out through a window in New York. And I don't know if you've ever been to New York, if you've ever seen them, but New York has these wooden water tanks atop a lot of the buildings. And they're these old sort of steampunk looking things that actually provide the water for a lot of the buildings in New York. And there's a bunch of reasons why this is the case. There is no better technology for giving you good shower pressure on the seventh floor in New York City. There's no better technology than a water tank that just holds a big bunch of water and then lets it out when you want your shower. Mm-hmm. And these things I think in their way, they're just gorgeous. And there are these sort of sentinels atop the roofs of a lot of the buildings in the city. So I shot one of those. It was like a whole bunch of water tanks. I shot one of those. I put it up in my social, and for whatever reason, people just sort of responded to it. And they're like, "Oh, that's so cool!" And so I posted another one a couple of days later, and a whole bunch of people were like, "Oh my God, that's so cool too!" And like, I began to think like, "Oh, maybe like I can do this, and other people will sort of enjoy it." And very gradually, that became, my eye sort of sharpened, my sense of what I wanted to convey to people, the fact that I could convey messages and even tell stories. Over the course of the next few years, those senses sharpened in me, and I became a lot better at post. I became a lot better at the editing part of it. And like you said, when you asked the question, like that, that began to resonate with my day job, and the extent to which we alter things past their initial rough state in order to pull the truth out of them. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, that's quite. I guess that's relevant to both literature and photography. It's kind of capturing something that's kind of out there and bringing it in and kind of either giving it a sense of purpose or revealing its purpose by how you. I think that's really well put, and it addresses how I feel about this kind of thing myself. In both when I'm editing other people's words or I'm editing my own images, there's a sense, like how do I put this? You kind of have to strip things away in order to reveal the essence, in order to reveal the truth. There's so much distracting noise in anything, in a rough draft of the manuscript, and certainly in just the stuff we see all around us. Part of what a good photographer can do is home in on the one telling angle or the one telling image in their entire field of view that speaks, that says something that rises above the noise of all the colors and shapes that our brains perceive. And in order to make a viewer see that, you got to strip all the other stuff away, and you got to hide. I often think, so I shoot exclusively with an iPhone and edit with Snapseed, and a lot of why I do that is because I love the idea of trying to extract the most from the least. Rather than shooting with a fancy DSLR, I like the idea of working with whatever everyone has in their pocket, and just trying to make as much as I can from that. It's sort of like it's in a way it's like the sonnet. The sonnet is such a limited form. It's like 14 lines, and it's got this very specific rhyme scheme, and it's got to be 10 syllables every line, and yet that's so limiting, and yet the people who are really good at it can make such huge art out of it, and so I love that idea of doing the most with the least, but I also love the idea of homing in on the essence. And a lot of what I do especially in post, when I'm editing photos, is bringing out the things that convey whatever truth was hidden inside the rough, the rough image. And it's like whatever I do in terms of drawing the final draft out of the rough draft of a manuscript. It's a bit of maybe a bit of a bridge to this, but this idea of kind of honing in on the truth is very much alive in the Too Much and Never Enough book by Mary Trump. Yeah, and
good segue, by the way. And I agree with you strongly. Thank you.
Well, I think especially, and we don't have to go into the exact details, but there is this kind of ethical dilemma, because there is this character with very apparent, at least in a sort of general consensus amongst a certain number of psychological professionals, that it's apparent that he has some psychological traits that verge on kind of the extreme spectrum, just through his own sort of public performance and personal history. And this goes back to a kind of problematic history of diagnosing public figures. I think a really good example is Freud. He would he wrote a lot about Da Vinci's own sort of sexuality and impulsivity, and looking back, it was him kind of reading his own psychodynamic theory into Da Vinci's life. Now it's a bit more, at least most claim it's a lot more accurate, because we have better psychological measures. We kind of we also have constant media, so we can really get a seemingly accurate depiction of this person's everyday behavior. I'm curious what your own opinion is on this topic of stripping away the truth, that you don't accidentally kind of bring your own sort of opinions and colored view of the world too much into a process, such as assessing someone's psychology when they're a political figure or a popular figure.
Yeah, I'm not going to give you a definitive answer to that question, but it's such a great question, and I guess the best thing I can say in summary is I'm really aware of that too, and I try to be, and I think the best thing I can do is to be conscious of it, like what I might, how I might be coloring my interpretation or my author's interpretation of anything in this realm, based on my own experience, my own background, my own foibles, my own whatever challenges I've had to deal with in psychic terms. So I think that I've done a pretty good job of that in general, and I am always asking myself the kind of questions you just raised. So I think awareness of the potential for that to happen and concern that it not happen is a pretty good, at least a pretty good defense against it's happening. Maybe not perfect, but pretty good is often the best you can get in the world that we live in. In terms of how it relates specifically to public figures and whether psychology has the right or indeed the duty to address the problems, the disorders that public figures might have. I'll say, first of all, I think that the discipline does have that responsibility. And I think that it's, you probably know, I don't know if there's something analogous in Canada, but in the States, the American Psychiatric Association has this thing called the Goldwater Doctrine, a Goldwater Rule, pardon me. And it came out of the 1964 election where Barry Goldwater was the Republican candidate, and a lot of people, either psych professionals or just pundits, were decided that they would do armchair diagnoses of this very unusual man. And it became, such a thing that the APA said, no, cut that out. You cannot do, if you're a member of our organization, you cannot perform psychological evaluations on anyone that you haven't actually treated. So that automatically cut off what I consider to be an important means of understanding public figures. Because then it became just the province of, news commentators and op-ed writers and stuff like that. Well, what we really need is people who are trained in this discipline to look at the evidence that is presented by the actions and the words of these people to help us determine whether they're actually capable of, if we're talking about politicians, capable of serving us in the way that we need to be served. I mean, Trump is the prototypical example of someone whose psychological challenges prevent him from serving anybody well, including himself, as Mary Jo points out. But the world. The world has been harmed by this man's, by the combination of the power he wielded for 4 years and the various disorders that he's had for 70, however old he is, 70 some odd years. And, I did a book, meaning I edited a book, now it's like 15 years ago, called Lincoln's Melancholy. So this book, the author is Joshua Wolfshank, and he's a genius. And this book fundamentally changed a lot of my attitudes about a lot of things in the world. But one of the things that woke me up to is the importance of looking at public figures, the importance of and the necessity of looking at public figures in psychological terms, even if they haven't sat on your couch and you're not a psychologist. Josh is a historian, but he wrote a book that I think, made an incredibly convincing case that Abraham Lincoln had what we would diagnose today as major depression. And so that was the premise, and he did a great job of setting that forth. And then the central argument of the book is that the certain aspects of his depression were essential to his success as president. And there were 4 elements, which I'm not going to remember all of them, but there's stuff in the DSM, the sort of the Bible of psychological and psychiatric diagnosis. There were 4 elements of depression that were key to his success. One was something called depressive realism, which you may have talked about in one of your episodes. Yeah. So basically, people with depression are basically better at seeing the world as it really is and predicting the future as it might turn out than are optimists like myself. So he was able to envision, the worst case scenario and prepare for it. So that's thing one. The other thing, the second of the 4 elements that I remember offhand is empathy. People with depression have a greater capacity for imagining how other people feel and acting upon that. And Lincoln was really good at that. And it's not just about, sort of hugging people and feeling good and singing Kumbaya. There's a tactical utility to understanding what other people's emotions might be in certain circumstances and then, acting accordingly. So that book made me feel like, you can even go back into history. And Lincoln was great because there's tons and tons and tons of documentation about Lincoln, stuff he wrote himself, stuff that was written about him. And then I did a book a couple of years after that, called, spacing on the title now. Oh, darn. I'll call it up as we talk here. That it was a psych professor at Tufts, and he did, essentially he talked about psychological maladies or conditions that are useful in politics and or leadership in general. And you mentioned narcissism, and narcissism does have certain, there are certain moments in which a certain amount of narcissism is useful for a politician. But there are other things like hypomania that mark a lot of politicians, throughout, many decades, that a first-rate madness, this book is called. And essentially the point of this, Nasir Ghami is the author, and he did a great job of sort of using everyone from Lincoln, as we discussed, to FDR, to Winston Churchill, to Bill Clinton, and sort of pointing to a bouquet of traits that might be considered disorders in psychological terms, but that are actually useful for leadership. So that all that sort of preamble set me up for thinking that psychology potentially has much more of a role in helping us understand the people in public roles than has been applied to date, and we really should apply it more. So when Mary Trump came along, who had this, she's a doctorate in psychology, she has various sorts of expertise that turn out to apply to her uncle, and of course she has this intimate understanding of her uncle from an early, from essentially her whole life and for the last 50 some years of his life. She's observed him at close range. So you put those things together, and even though the APA would say, oh, no, you're not allowed to analyze this person, he hasn't, sat in your office. She did, I think, and your episode drawing on the book, I think, suggests this as well. I think she did a fantastic job of unpacking exactly what's wrong with this guy and exactly why it's so harmful for the rest of us.
Yeah, well, and I remember, because one of the main arguments, as we've been discussing, is is he, is it colored? Does she maybe over exaggerate. But I think that Dan McAdams, who's he wrote an incredible op-ed, and I believe I read he was somewhat involved with the book.
That Dan McAdams, he's is he at Northwestern? I think he wrote a piece in the Atlantic years ago that I thought did a fantastic job.
Mm-hmm. This is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, it was. I think it was the summer before the election, so we hadn't seen Trump in his full flower. But Dan did a great job, I think, in that piece of sort of suggesting what was to come. And it was a thing that actually, I tried to buy that book. I tried to acquire that book, the book based on that article. And I love, one of the things he pointed out that I thought was fantastic and revealing and unnerving is that Trump has no capacity to Trump doesn't have an internal narrative. And that, so he lacks a sort of an ability to assemble narrative, either about himself, and of course most of us have that. It can be faulty, but at least we have a way of sort of making sense of ourselves and the world. Trump lacks that altogether, which is why he's such a creature of the moment, and why he doesn't learn anything. It's astonishing how ineducable that man is.
Well, I think he mentions that Trump's sort of narrative would kind of reflect that Jungian warrior archetype, which is that they're always out for battle. Their, victory is what they live for. Defeat is the most devastating, consequence. And that he kind of questions, after looking through his whole biography, what exactly he is fighting for. Because he does always seem like he's fighting, but what he's actually fighting for doesn't appear to be, an idea greater than himself. And I think I brought that up in the video, is that he doesn't have, and it's similar with a lot of narcissistic cases, is this, Eric Fromm called it kind of having an unsubmitted will, that almost all other people, they submit to something, whether they're religious or not. Maybe it's not God, but maybe it's a sense of justice, or, family values, something that's higher than themselves. And that Trump doesn't have this. So what he's fighting for doesn't really go beyond his own self-promotion and self-preservation, which in reality is very difficult, because what one area or one group of people consider successful or worthy of admiration, another group of people don't. So it's very difficult to construct a narrative where you're always the best in the world or the greatest in the world, when you live in a reality that has a very relative definition of what best and greatest is. So in a way, his kind of, an attempt to battle that appears to be this adoption of warrior type values, at least as McAdams kind of assesses it to be.
Yeah, and I think you're and you're right in pointing out that McAdams, that he's drawing on a set of on the Jungian archetypes, whereas Mary Trump is more psychodynamic, I think. But I think both are I think really smart and really, and their conclusions are really useful as ways to understand Trump. I think that one of the things they would agree upon, and you're sort of implying in the way you described how McAdams talks about Trump, is there, and this is true of narcissism, is there is no center, there is no core, there is no essence. It's a black hole. Narcissists are insatiable in terms of the amount of attention. You could pay them 26 hours a day of attention and it wouldn't be enough. And it's part of why there's such a drain on everyone around them, because, and part of why Trump ran through, what was the turnover in his, in the West Wing? It was multiples higher than the turnover in the West Wing is typically for a presidency. And it was, all the high profile people we heard about who ran screaming, but also it was tons and tons of lower level people who we didn't know about, because they would just move out of their sort of mid-level appointment and hope to, try to lick their wounds. That's part of the reason I think that this stuff matters, that, looking at the psyches of people like Trump, examining them closely as we would examine his tax returns, if only we'd gotten to see them, is because it has a huge effect on the rest of us. One of the things that that makes me mad about the Goldwater Rule is that it prevents us from seeing. See if I get this right. I'm thinking as I talk here, so we'll see if I agree with myself at the end of the sentence. I think there's psychology works at levels beyond the individual. That is to say, things that we think of as only happening within families, or only happening between individuals, or only happening within an individual, also operate at the societal level. So for me, a good, painful, anecdotal example of that is the impeachment trial going on right now. We're talking on February 12th. And today is the day in which Trump's lawyers are presenting their case. And for me, and I think, I'm sure for millions of people, literally millions of people watching it, it's triggering. And I mean triggering in the strict clinical sense. And from that, I extrapolate that we certainly as Americans, and I would argue, people in, elsewhere in the world as well, but especially for Americans, we have been placed in an abusive relationship. And for people who've experienced abuse before, it's particularly problematic. But for people who haven't experienced abuse before, well, this is what it's like, or this is a fair representation of what it's like to not have the control, to have a sense of chaos that buffets you at every turn, even to hear the voice again. There were a couple of great weeks there when he wasn't on Twitter and he had already left the Oval Office, where we didn't hear his voice that much. And then over the past couple of days, for me, mostly through the Democratic testimony for the impeachment trials, we're watching him speechify again, and the visceral reaction, the visceral pain that it creates, and that operates on, again, a societal level, is something that I think we have to think about and address. These people affect us. You talk about Hannah Arendt, I think very wisely in more than one of your episodes, and she wrote about the banality at length about the banality of evil, and we saw it unfold over the last 4 years, and I think it'll continue to unfold for reasons we can talk about it if there's time. He normalized shitloads of bad behavior that essentially allowed thousands of people to converge upon the Capitol in Washington and try to hang Mike Pence and, kill other senators and do all the other shit they wanted to do.
Well, especially when you brought up both this idea of emptiness on the individual level, but also that psychology is, it operates on both a societal and individual level. It really makes me think of, I don't know if you've ever seen American Psycho. But there's okay. Well, yeah, I'm not sure how close the book is with the movie, but at the end, he kind of goes on a bit of a monologue about how deep down there's just this nothingness, and it's this paranoia that it seems like no matter how bad he acts out, because he's just perfectly reflecting these kind of consumerist, materialistic, vain values, that no one really seems to be bothered. No one seems to care. And it's just this realization at the end that there are no consequences to his actions, and that there's really nothing on the inside. And I think it operates on that, maybe why narcissistic disorders are so kind of compelling for writers to discuss, because it's like this idea of somebody without an identity. And then I also think Trump was kind of in that yuppie era of neoliberal businessmen that were, they would surround themselves with models and that he is a bit of a Patrick Bateman character, that there is this seeming emptiness within that seems to be covered up quite well by this material decadence and reflecting these values that are in themselves kind of empty.
Yeah, and there's that's bringing up the American Psycho, and that's in the book too. There's a version of that in the book, um, and it is something that and that I can't remember when the movie came out. The book came out, I think, in the late '80s, and it's very much, the '80s were very much a decade of all of this that we're talking about right now. I mean, that's when Donald Trump came into his own, of course, as a fictional character. I mean, that's the thing too, is that essentially Donald Trump is a work of fiction. Nothing about him is actually true. And Mary does a great job in the book of showing, just how what a Potemkin individual he is. The extent to which he is this two-dimensional creation, behind which there's essentially nothing.
Well, that's McAdams brings up in his Atlantic profile, which I found very interesting, because all of the arguments against profiling him psychologically is that, well, it's just an act. But McAdams says, well, it seems like all he is this act. We never see him out of the act. So even if like this isn't who he is, there doesn't seem to be anything under that. So he's almost become kind of like his mask.
Yeah, exactly. He faked it until he made it horrible for us. Whether or not there is anything there in an individual, especially an individual in public life who influences the rest of us, whether or not there's anything, behind the persona doesn't matter. The persona is what affects us. And it's, in his case, he's probably the single most poisonous persona. God, I don't even know how far back to go in order to pick one. I don't want to overstate any cases, but he's people have died. You could argue in hundreds of thousands because of his persona.
Well, in the video I bring up, because Chomsky made the controversial kind of comparison of Trump to like Hitler, Stalin, and he does say that Chomsky believes that he is the worst criminal in history. And I don't entirely like endorse that statement, but I understand what he's saying, in that maybe not in consequence, because he obviously didn't commit any sort of, actual genocide,
exactly, despite his desire to do so. But you're right, he couldn't carry it out, thank God.
Yeah, but he is, what Chomsky was concerned with is this kind of almost like a psychology of nihilism in him, where it's like even Hitler and Stalin appeared to be at certain points compelled by higher ideas, where Trump would literally, there was a fair amount of consensus that he could just decide to nuke or wage war based off of, tweets or petty comments exchanged between foreign leaders, that he was so dangerous because he lacked any sort of, as we said before, a submission of will. He was completely unchecked because he had no sort of identity. It was like this sort of hole and this persona that was so ambiguous in direction other than promoting its greatness. So I think I understand the sort of risk of overstating, but if someone's already overstated it, it's Chomsky, and I think it's a relevant statement to make, that he at least in intention, he might be considered the worst criminal in human history. I think he specifically justified it because he seemed to have no sort of care, or at certain times seemed to strive to destroy or bring suffering to organized human life.
Yeah, I think that's, I think Chomsky's right, and I think you're right to invoke him in this context. And I will say I'm not a huge Chomsky fan. I think he was wrong about more than he was right about, especially in terms of language and acquisition and stuff like that. But I think where Chomsky really sheds bright light here is the fact that the absence of an ideology is perhaps even worse than adherence to a bad ideology. Donald Trump would do. I think Chomsky is right, and you're right to bring him up. If Trump had thought one day, oh, it could be great for me to push the nuclear button, he would have. You know, and he didn't have the capacity to think through the consequences. There was no sort of, you can't even do like the basic, what saved us in the Cold War was the notion of mutually assured destruction. Everyone knew on both sides, the Soviets and the Americans, that if they pushed the button, the other side would push the button and everyone would be fucked. Donald Trump, in his mind, I think he just lacks the capacity to carry out that equation to its last term. And the inability to do that is the inability to understand how ideologies engage with each other. Because again, his only ideology, to go back to what you were saying before, is some sort of, sense of doing battle with the world and having to win every battle. And of course, the thing about, we haven't talked about it in this context, but one of the problems with Donald Trump too is that he has no self-control. He has no sense of, he couldn't pass the marshmallow test. He has no capacity to value the long term over the short term. And
that's brought up when they do research with, they call them like productive or proactive narcissists that are considered to, they're actually, when they're involved in an institution or something greater than themselves, they are able to actually boost it. And it is because of this need for self-promotion, but they are also able to regulate their impulses. And they, perhaps they identify that in the long run, they would do a better job at promoting themselves by a regulation of impulses. So you can consider them maybe more disciplined narcissists. But that is because it is brought up that also just most presidents appear to be somewhat narcissistic, or, they displayed behavior that you would label as being narcissistic. And that doesn't seem to be the specific variable that kind of separates Trump from others. The variable seems to be how he managed this narcissism, and that it became kind of a bit more toxic. And as you said, this sort of inability to regulate his own impulses seemed to reign supreme in a lot of his actions.
Yeah, I think, that's exactly right. I think it's a lot about impulse control. The other thing I would say, and I'm not sure how convincingly I can support this thesis, but I'm going to say it anyway, is I think part of Donald's problem, and one of the things I love about the way Mary approaches Donald is she always calls him by his first name, because you know how he loved to be called this. He loved all the titles. And she was like, oh, no, I am not going to give him titles. So let us call him Donald. So one of the things about Donald that I think is notable is his cognitive failings. There's a lot of stuff, leaving aside the innumerable psychological challenges that this man has and has inflicted upon us all. I think there's a lot of stuff he can't do cognitively that you and I can. And for example, the inability to sort of follow logic, I just think there's, he is, it's like, I'm not saying that he's flawed in cognitive terms in ways that someone who, leads the most powerful country in the world should not be. And the cognitive stuff is as problematic as the psychological stuff.
And I mean, I think I make the claim in the video also that cognitive is almost tied in, because there's this whole epistemology of, especially those that suffer from NPD, is they really do, going along with this idea that because they live in a reality where it's impossible to be the best at everything because best is relative, they need to start kind of manipulating their reality. And one way they do this is through promoting this epistemology that just does not line up, this sense of reality that doesn't line up with how other people see it. And it can actually be sort of a social deficit, especially in terms of meta communication, which is the ability to actually interpret and understand other people's kind of motivations behind what they're saying. I mean, it's somewhat ironic because McAdams definitely hits home with this. Trump has this sort of schema of the deal. And what's interesting is that actually, the process of a deal would require a great level of meta communication. And I mean, I think it's fairly evident in just whatever side you're on, the amount of things he could actually get passed while he was president, in the Senate, the Congress. That's a process that requires deal making, that requires actually seeing someone, understanding what they're trying to do, understanding what they're trying to communicate. And he does, at least in those terms, suffer some sort of cognitive deficit that I think you could argue is a product of his own need to manufacture his own reality.
Yeah, and I think you're right to sort of to link it to NPD. In the episode and here in this conversation is NPD. NPD and the other psychological conditions have similar effects. NPD has creates cognitive deficits because it prevents you from. If you're prevented from being able to, empathy is great. It's very, it's great to hug people and all that. But empathy is really useful, especially as a deal maker. And as a book editor, I'm making deals all the time. That's another part of the job that I really like is you're trying to come to an agreement as to how much how much money you're going to pay and how much effort you're going to put in or how much effort the author is going to put in. It's a very complicated and fun process. And I'm capable of doing it pretty well because I'm able to understand what I'm able to grok what every party hopes for in the outcome. Mm-hmm. Trump is a shitty deal maker because he can't do that. He simply can't do that. I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead, you go.
Oh, well, because I mean, I remember in retellings of how he used to make deals, it was basically this idea of is the only deal that's won is if you don't pay any money at all, which is from the outset a very, you're not considering the other party's own motivations. You're not being very realistic either. And it is probably this kind of adoption of what his father tried to instill in them, which Mary Trump writes about, which is, there can only be one winner and everyone else is a loser. There's no way you're going to reach any sort of empathy when you're communicating from that angle. That angle is purely from your own perspective, and it's purely based on your own motivations, and it's incredibly black and white. You either win or you lose. And
you're not going to make good deals as a result. Practically speaking, I mean, Donald is a terrible deal maker. 5 bankruptcies later, and Trump University and all the stuff that we know about. He is, I defy you to show me an example of a good deal that he's made. And he, as Mary points out in the book, he got away with it up until 2017 because he'd always been propped up by something or other, either his father's money, vast infusions of his father's money. Over the course of decades, or the hype of The Apprentice, in which he was presented as the sort of figure that he fundamentally is not, and that it was. I mean, he's been only really been fully exposed in the last 4 years for his inability to make any sort of deal. For the reasons that we've just been talking about, because of his inability to sort of, again, it's a cognitive deficit. He cannot understand other. He doesn't have any mirror neurons functionally,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess going back to just what is believed to be kind of causing this, which is this sort of emptiness. that's what interested me primarily when I made that episode. And also just in Trump as a person, somebody acting that strangely is, you want to know what's kind of making them tick, what's motivating them, what gets them up in the morning. And to kind of understand this sort of, going back to his kind of struggles with identity, proposed struggles with identity, there is something very interesting about that. And also it kind of taps into a more universal theme that, everybody has their struggles with identity. Everyone at one time or another has probably acted more self-interested, maybe not to the extent of a narcissist, but they want to promote themselves in some way. Mm-hmm. And I guess it would just be very interesting to kind of talk about the role of narcissism in literature in general, and maybe why so many artists and authors kind of gravitate towards discussing the themes of narcissism, as well as maybe creating characters that exhibit these sort of traits. In my video, there was an incredible paper on Moby Dick and narcissism, and it was this idea of that there was this desire to literally kind of construct one's own reality and unlock all of these deeper secrets to humanity. And that's what was kind of driving it. And I just kind of want to get your thoughts on kind of maybe the history and prevalence of narcissism in literature.
Well, first of all, I think you're exactly right to suggest that there's a lot of it in literature. And one of the things that fascinates me about literature in general, and I'd take it back, to the Bible, or to the classical mythology, or the Vedic scriptures. I mean, you go all the way back, and it's like proto-psychology. Like, literature was the first psychology. Like, way before we had that word, way before we had the notion that people live in their lives, that's what was going on in these epic poems and in the fiction that came along later. The romances of the Middle Ages and Chaucer and all that great stuff. They were already engaging with this stuff. And in terms of narcissism in particular, and with the appeal of it, one of the things in the DSM that sticks in my mind is, why narcissism works for politicians and why it works more than it's like. You could ask yourself, why hasn't narcissism just been bred out of the species? I mean, it's so corrosive. It's so all this bad stuff that we've just been talking about. It has, one of its components is a certain kind of surface charisma. For whatever reason, mm-hmm. someone like Trump, someone name the narcissist in your own life, is you got to admit that on the surface, people who don't know them that well are like, oh no, I like them. They're they've got a certain je ne sais quoi. They're fun, like that. So I think that charisma is part of what makes them a draw, both for other people initially and for writers of the sort that we're talking about, but also that they're larger than life and smaller than life at the same time. Larger than life, and that there's always this element of bombast. I'm thinking about, we're talking about who, some of the great narcissists. You and I haven't talked about this before, but I'm like, I go to King Lear as one, say, mm-hmm. and Mr. Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, it seems to be another. And I could, if I suck my thumb for a minute, I'd come up with 5 or 10 more, I'm sure, because you're right. They're just the literary landscape is littered with them. So there's that sort of initial charm, but beyond that, there's this notion that they're bigger than life and smaller than life at the same time. Like, there's always an element of bombast. There's always an element of, like, they're good copy. Mm-hmm. One thing, someone interviewed me for a New York Times Magazine article about Trump last summer, and I said, like, love him or hate him, he makes good copy, and it's true. Like, he's quotable, mm-hmm. He's like you, and that's part. We could talk about the media and the media's complicity in Trump's rise, but part of it is you sort of can't blame him for it. It's like, he just says good shit, you know? It's like, you like, I disagree with it, but I followed him on Twitter for 4 years until, thank God, they took him down. So there's, you know, so there's that, but at the same time, the center cannot hold. You know, they are that ironic disparity between what's on the surface and what's at the core is part of what makes them such interesting, like, literary figures. You know, and why I think people are so willing to explore them. The other thing too is, again, literature is psychology. I mean, writers, in particular fiction writers, they're writing often to work their way through their own psychic struggles. And, you know, I think there are a few people who are listening. There are, you know, I don't know how many people on the call, but certainly me on the call, you know, this side of the call. You know, there are narcissists in my own life, and they're compelling figures. They're, you know, they're horrific figures in a lot of ways, but they're more compelling than the nice, that other nice guy over there who I really liked, you know? They're good copy. You know, they're rich in narrative terms. For all that they don't have a narrative that guides their own life, that for all their own absence of an ability to understand narrative in the way McAdams talked about in that Atlantic article, they make, you know, they are the engines of good stories.
Yeah, I was just thinking, yeah. Well, while you were talking, I was thinking it's, I mean, there's those kind of common conflicts of man versus nature, man versus society and stuff. And then there's man versus self. And there is something compelling. And I think a lot of these stories about narcissists, the more kind of gratifying, cathartic ones are the ones that go from man versus something external to man versus self in the end, where it's this kind of revelation where they realize that they need to get over themselves in some way, that they need to do some introspection and self-reflection. And I think just in everybody's life, those are just common moments where you realize that, you know, maybe you're a bit of the problem, that maybe you should, you know, readapt. And yeah,
that's true. I mean, that's really smart. I think one of the purposes that narcissists serve for us, and I'm getting past Trump and, you know, all the damage he's wrought, but one of the purposes that narcissists serve for us in literature and in our own lives is they're exaggerated versions of our own worst impulses. Like, we look at them and we go, oh, wait a second. I gotta watch that. You know, I might do a little of that myself. I gotta be careful of it. Whereas a subtler sort of, you know, someone saying, you know, maybe there's a moment in which you need someone to sort of bonk you over the head, you know, with, again, an account of, you know, Captain Ahab's narcissism, or Mary Trump's account of her uncle's narcissism, make you go, you know what, gotta watch that, you know.
Well, that's yeah. No, that's the thing that I think maybe it's a bit of frustration, and why it kind of feels like an abusive relationship is that maybe we're kind of conditioned to eventually go, you know, this person will inevitably realize that they're too self-interested, and, you know, this is a condition. Maybe they won't be able to, I mean, there's no real cure for narcissism, but they can manage it.
NPD and borderline are two of the hardest psychological conditions to address. And part of it is because, oh shoot, I wish there's a great technical term for it, but it may come back to me. But there is a term in psychology for one's inability to recognize their problem, and you probably know it. But I've forgotten it. No. But of course, narcissists, they're very hard to treat. Their narcissism is very hard to treat because they don't recognize it. And again, borderline, it's kind of similar. And, you know, so for the people who live in the orbit of the narcissist, often the only way to deal with it is to leave the orbit, you know. And part of what's problematic when narcissism is allowed to inhabit the Oval Office, for example, is, you know, at least until for 4 years, you can't escape it. there is no way to step aside unless you have sort of dual citizenship and can move to another country. There is no way around it or out of it. And that's part of, I think, what's traumatic about having a narcissist in a position of power like the one we were talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to kind of sum up that discussion in a sense. We're already over an hour into this, but I think just for out of curiosity's sake, briefly, because I feel like a lot of my viewers would be interested. You also were the editor for The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Yeah, and I'm just wondering. Yeah, no, I'm just wondering what are some of your thoughts on the book and kind of your own opinion of the new atheism movement, especially nowadays when it seems to have calmed down a little bit.
Well, it's, as an editor, one of the things that I hope to do and strive to do is change people's minds. And I think Richard's book did that for a lot of people. I think so. The other thing the thing I should say that's closely related to that is that book came out in, I think, 2006, if I remember correctly, and it was published into a very specific moment in the U.S. and the U.K., less so in Canada because you guys are smarter. But there was it was Bush's. Partway into Bush's second term, W's second term, and the Christian right held such sway, and were such a harmful influence. And Richard's book, I had published in Richard before, and this book that he wrote wasn't a science book. It wasn't The Selfish Gene. It wasn't the any of this stuff. It was a little bit outside of his realm, but. And I will say he took a harder stand against religion than I myself would, but I felt at the time that, damn, someone needs to throw a grenade into this room. Someone needs, you can't do an incremental argument about how we really need to rethink the way we approach. It's like someone needs to come in and just sort of take you by the shoulders and shake you and say, God is a delusion. Religion is wrong. The process of working with Richard, in the process, one of the great things about Richard is he's a big believer in evidence and the scientific method. So I was able to sort of say to him as we were working, think about whether what you're saying is provable or not, whether it's anecdotal or whether it's evidentiary and that kind of thing. And I think in the end, Richard said, I can't prove whether or not there is a God, but I can prove that, or I can argue plausibly that religion has done more harm than good. And he argued plausibly enough that a lot of people started to think. And I felt then, and I still feel that there's that book, and there's there are a couple of others that kind of stand as scriptures of the new atheism. Part of what I wanted to do too with that book and with Mary's book as well, Mary Trump's book as well, is I wanted to give people something that would help them understand, but also that would give them their own script. Like if you're going home for Thanksgiving or Christmas and you're sitting across from your fundamentalist uncle, what are a bunch of things you could say that would actually, even if you're not convincing him, even would allow you to hold your own in the discussion of why, religion is problematic. At least the fundamentalist version of it is problematic. And I think Richard's book did, he's not the only one. Sam Harris and Sullivan, there are a couple of others who've done fantastic work of the same sort. But he provided that. Part of the reason that book sells, 15 years later, is because it is the gospel of the new atheism. And it expresses the what can go wrong with religion. And remember that book, that book was the world has changed a lot since then. We no longer, in the Biden administration anyway, we don't worry as much about Islamism and these sort of notional versions of terrorism. But Richard was trying to address that. Is you can't you how do I put this? You can't. You shouldn't use religion as an identifier, either to describe yourself or to describe the other. And I feel that has gone mainstream, at least in again in the post-Trump world. Trump tried to sort of set that back, with shithole countries and such like. But Richard was standing against that as well, the notion of tarring or feathering anyone because they are, describe themselves a certain way. So, so Richard's book, I think, stands the test of time, even though as an editor, I didn't feel as strongly as I did about certain, because I'm working on a book right now, editing a book right now, which will come out next year, called How God Works, which is about sort of spiritual technologies and the things that various religions invented that are actually incredibly useful in psychological terms for helping us get through the various travails of life. So I myself have not thrown, that baby out with the bathwater. But again, in the moment, I thought that we needed to throw a bomb in the room. And even now, 15 years later, I think that Richard still expresses a valuable view, questions the overreach of religion in valuable ways. Fundamentalism of any sort is bad, and religion has historically been the easiest way to get to a corrosive fundamentalist view, and that's essentially what Richard is calling out. And, thank God he does.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it goes back to what you said at the start, which is one of the editor's biggest tasks is kind of assessing and predicting kind of what are the sort of topics that in the moment are going to be the most relevant and maybe
that's right,
lead to some greater change or at least some greater thinking and deliberation about these issues.
One of the things I'd say in relation to that too is with Richard, again, I didn't agree with everything he said, but I respected and admired his intellect and his own willingness to engage with the questions that he was raising.
Well, I think on that note, it's probably a good idea to wrap things up. I do feel like we could probably talk for like 4 or 5 hours still, but
it would be so fun to do so. But I'll release it also into the wild.
But do you have any sort of closing thoughts or anything you'd like to share?
No, I appreciate that. We covered a lot of ground. I so enjoyed it. I said this to you before, but I'll say it, here again. I love the work you do. I'm glad that I could be a part of it and honored. And thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And thank you to your son for reaching out also.
Yeah, thanks, Oscar. I really appreciate him turning me on to you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for coming on, and thank you for listening.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right.
And thank you. Bye.